Thank you everybody for coming tonight, and happy first day of spring. Tonight, what I'm going to talk about is an extraordinary phenomenon. Aboriginal art is both the newest and most ancient art form. It is a continuous artistic tradition which stretches back some 50,000 years. So I always think it's helpful if you think of a visit to the British Museum and seeing the ancient Egyptians and thinking, gosh, that's really old, 3,000 years. This is 50,000 years of continuous artistic tradition. And it's an artistic tradition which isn't just empty or meaningless designs. It's incredibly powerful and reflects an extraordinary culture. And if there's nothing else that you take away from you this evening, I'd like you to realise that there is no such thing as Aboriginal art. Black Australia is many, many nations. The easiest analogy is to compare it to Europe. There are many different countries, each of which has its own distinct language, the people of which have their own distinct physiognomy, their own distinct customs and ways of doing things. However, the one thing that unites all these disparate nations that were across Australia before the Europeans arrived was the love of the land and the relationship that Aboriginal people had with their land. And of course, because these are different countries, their practices are reflected in different art. And what I want to show you tonight is literally a tour through some of these countries so you can realise the richness and diversity of Aboriginal culture. And what you will be seeing is merely the tip of the iceberg. It is an extraordinary thing. And I could speak for 10 years, don't worry, I'm only going to speak for 40 minutes, but I could speak for 10 years on the amazing countries and cultural achievements of these Aboriginal nations. I think it's probably a good idea to start sort of in my lifetime. When I was born in Melbourne in 1955, it is astonishing to think that Aboriginal people were not citizens in their own country. They were unable to buy a house, they did not have a passport, they were not able to go abroad, buy alcohol, really do anything that we take for granted. They were wards of the state. They had no legal rights at all. And when I was 12 in 1967, a referendum was held and the Australian white population voted and said Aboriginal people could be citizens in their own country. But it is astonishing that really it's only 50 years that Aboriginal people have had rights in the country which they have inhabited for 50,000 years. It's also quite salutary to think that the first ever Aboriginal citizen was an artist. And I will tell you his story because I think it is quite a sad one, but it does actually reflect the impact that has happened time and time again when Aboriginal people have tried to enter the white arena and have succeeded in it, and then have somehow ended up being burnt and, like Icarus, fallen to the ground in flames. The first Aboriginal artist and citizen was Albert Namatjira, and he was born in a place called Haas Bluff in 1902. This is in the central Australian desert, very, very beautiful countryside, surrounded by the McDonnell Ranges, a wonderful range of mountains which changes colour, beautiful purples and blues. When he was a young man, a British watercolourist came to the central desert to recuperate from tuberculosis. And he wanted a young Aboriginal guide to take him out into the desert and to look after the camels. So he asked for volunteers at Hermannsburg Mission Station, which is where Albert Namatjira grew up. And Albert Namatjira volunteered to go along as the cameleteer for this watercolourist who was called Rex Batterby. So they went out into the desert, and Albert used to watch Rex Batterby do these watercolours. And he painted the gum trees and the McDonnell Ranges and the sunrise and the sunset. And Albert kept watching him and he thought, gosh, I could do that. So he asked Rex if it would be possible, and Rex said, well, if you give your services to me for nothing, I will teach you to paint watercolours. And so Albert learnt to paint watercolours and showed a remarkable facility for doing this. And very shortly, Rex was amazed. And it's interesting to think that when I was at school in the 50s, we were taught, and this is actually a fact, that Aboriginal people were the missing link between Stone Age people, Neanderthal man, and modern day humans. They were so marginalised. And so Albert Namatjira suddenly, learning to paint, went against what was the popular conception. People said, goodness, how can an Aboriginal do something so accomplished, so skilled? And as a result, he was brought to the city-states of Melbourne and Sydney. And he went to Melbourne and he met the Queen in 1952. And he was paraded around as almost a performing monkey. Hello, Bob. How are you? Hello, come in. And so when, after a while, many good-meaning Australian citizens said, gosh, I think we should make Albert Namatjira an Australian citizen. And by this time, actually, he didn't want to be an Australian citizen because he'd become thoroughly disillusioned with his interaction with European people. However, despite his wishes to the contrary, he was made an Australian citizen in 1957. And of course, as an Australian citizen, he was able to buy alcohol. And of course, as an Aboriginal person, he shared everything he had with his family. So he took alcohol back to his camp at Hossack and shared it with his family. And for this, he was arrested and tried and put in jail for 6 months. After he was released, he came back home to Hossack and he sat under a tree, and he died very shortly thereafter of, his family said, a broken heart. And before he died, he said, why don't they just end it all? Why don't they put a gun to my head and shoot me? For that is what they want. Why don't they end it all for us? And that, I'm afraid, is the story of the first Aboriginal Australian citizen, Albert Namatjira. However, the story is not all doom and gloom, and indeed, through the strength of some of the paintings that you're going to see tonight, Aboriginal people have had great empowerment, and some of the paintings which you're going to see have been used in courts of law and have enabled Aboriginal people to claim back tracts of their own land, tracts of land which are as great as the city, as Britain itself. So before we begin anything to look at these pictures, I think it's really important for you to understand the concept that underlies all these pictures, the concept of the dreaming. Now, the dream time has many different words in many different Aboriginal languages, and it's not really anything to do with dream time as we might think of it. It's a concept of creation. But it's another word for it is Jakurpa. And Aboriginal people, of course, the stories of creation stories differ in different communities, but they all have this underlying thing that the past is always with the present and will ensure the future. And so in the beginning, there was nothing. And out of this nothingness came the ancestors, and they walked across the land and they sung it into existence. And as they moved across the land, they had human characteristics, many of them. They loved, they fought, they were unfaithful to each other. They took all sorts of forms. They took the forms of animals, some took the forms of rocks, some took the forms of trees, some of fish, but they were not confined to the physical properties of those particular things. So fish could run on land or burrow underneath. Trees and rocks could walk across the land. Nothing was the same. Everything was constantly metamorphosing. But at the same time, the natural physical world was being created. Everything was being created. A blade of grass, a beetle, the sun, the moons, rocks, stars. But also the ancestors represented groups of things. They represented bushfires or swarms of bees, complex ideas. And when these ancestors, for example, if they lay down, they made a valley. If they wept, their tears made a lake. And when they had finished creating, some of them went down into the earth where they remained. Some went up into the sky where they became the stars and celestial bodies, and others remained on Earth as sacred rocks or trees. So the whole landscape is totally informed by the doings of these ancestral beings in the dream time. It's still there today. Their physical presence is manifest. Some of them sunk back into the rocks. You'll see later a Wandjina figure imprinting themselves into the rocks. So the paintings that you see today are manifestations of that cultural phenomenon, of that Jakirpa, that dream time. And of course, for 50,000 years, Aboriginal people have not been painting paintings on canvas using acrylics. But these paintings were done using marks on the body, using natural ochres, carving into rocks, petroglyphs, or indeed carving into trees, sacred trees, dendroglyphs, beautiful patterns into the trees. And indeed, huge sand drawings, as big as a football pitch, were often created, sand sculptures, where the sand was piled high and covered with the white fluff of birds attached to make differential markings, often using human blood or gum arabic to attach it. And in a ceremony, a Dreamtime ceremony, the dancers who had created this huge sculpture, amazing sculpture, would then dance and destroy the sculpture, but at the same time, the Chingari, the ancestral beings, would come out of the ground, mingle with the dancers in the present, and therefore ensure the future of whatever was the particular species or ancestor being honoured. So I think it's important that you remember that all the pictures that we see are rich in this content. Although they are very, very dazzling patterns, very beautiful on the surface, they are so much more. They are so rich. And I mean, if you think of the great religious art that's been produced by our civilization, the early Renaissance paintings, where there was such a strong spiritual belief in the world, they have a real parallel with that. They are not empty pictures. And I myself found, when I opened my gallery, that I was very disillusioned with contemporary art, particularly contemporary Western art. I found that young artists were very cynical, they were very self-serving, they were very arrogant, they were very ironic, they were very interested in fame and wealth. There was no heart, there was no generosity of spirit. And of course I generalise, but on the whole, this is how I found the contemporary art world today. And I felt that art should reflect the spirit, and the place where I found the spirit was in these non-Western cultures, and particularly Aboriginal culture. I found that the art really had something to say, and it really had a belief and respect in the natural world. All right, so we're now going to start looking at the contemporary paintings, and I want you to remember that they have been transferred from these ancient designs that were painted on bodies and rocks and trees and the ground. Is that my little thing to... Oh, that's exciting. Oh.
The other direction. No, let's go. Keep going the other direction.
Which one? Is that right? Oh, phew. Okay, I just put in a couple of shots of the land because I think that I cannot stress more closely the relationship with the land. And one of my Aboriginal friends, a Yolngu woman from up in the north in East Arnhem Land, said to me, "Rebecca, we are the tongue on the body of the land." And I think that's such an incredible description. You really can't get much closer than that, to be the tongue on the body. And if you think of your tongue itself and how it's connected to your body and what it means. And also it's a very beautiful thing because it also means metaphorically, we will speak for the land. And she was saying that to me when she was trying to describe a very complex painting. And it was impossible for me to understand because I had not the knowledge that she had acquired. But I thought how beautiful it was when she said, "We are the tongue on the body of the land." So here is the land. Bob, does that make you homesick? And I think you can feel the presence. I mean, I really do think you can feel the presence of the ancestors and this ancestral power. And I think the Aboriginals have been wonderful custodians of the land of Australia. And you still can, and thank goodness they have, and you still can feel their presence. As I said to you, Aboriginal art is incredibly diverse and it's many countries. So this is an example of one particular country, the Kimberley region. And this is a Wandjina figure representing the cult of the Wanan. Some people believe that the ancestral figures in the Dreamtime actually went back into the rock and left this mark there. And you can see that his eyes and nose are conjoined and he has no mouth. And again, some people say that he hears and that he sees everything, but he never says anything. He just watches. And here you have the lonka lonka, the pearl shell pendant, which is worn in the Kimberley region, incised and giving power. These figures are probably have their origins for about 3,000 years ago, and they're painted in natural ochre on the rock. And today, contemporary artists have actually transferred these designs onto bark painting and kept the cult going. But these figures are constantly repainted in ceremonies as a time of replenishing and refreshing them. So that they're constantly renewed and very alive. I wanted to just show you this petroglyph of a Chingari circle. Whenever you see this form of concentric circles, it doesn't always represent a Chingari, an ancestral being, and the place where they re-entered the earth. Sometimes it can represent a breast or a pool. Aboriginal art is often like poetry. It depends on the context in which the symbol is used, how you can read it. But that is the origin of this motif, which you will see a lot in the paintings. And here we have gone across Australia again. Oh, actually, we have got the map here. That's great. So we've gone up to the Tiwi Islands up here, from the Kimberley here. And this is a Tiwi Island dancer with white cockatoo feathers in her hair. And I put that in again so you could see the body markings, which again later became transcribed into their art. The Aboriginal art has become widely regarded as one of the great art movements in the world. It's a $1 billion industry now. And Robert Hughes, the Time critic from the New York Times, has called it the last great art movement of the 20th century, which is some claim when you think of the amazing art movements of the 20th century. I believe that it has continued into the 21st century because just when you think you've seen it all, some extraordinary art movement will spring up in the middle of the desert with a totally new and incredible iconography and fantastic genius of an artist producing extraordinary work. So I believe that the vitality and energy is still there. However, what has really made Aboriginal art famous throughout the Western world is the contemporary desert paintings, which are acrylic on canvas. And the story began only some 30 odd years ago in a little place called Papunya, right in the centre here. And it began with this man, this tall blonde man. The story of Geoffrey Barden is quite an inspiring one, and it shows how one individual can affect the course of thousands of people, as he has done with the tens of thousands of Aboriginals who are now earning a living making art, and the incredible knowledge and interest that's gone around the world as a result of this. When I was young, as I told you, and Aboriginals were made citizens in 1967, the Australian government had a policy of assimilation. And they thought, we will round up all the Aboriginal groups and we will put them into what somebody on my course said today I have to call concentration camps. They were called settlements, but I will use that word then, concentration camps, because we will then teach them to assimilate and they will learn to live like us. But of course you can see from this map, this represents pre-contact Aboriginal Australia, and each of these colours represents a different language group, a different country if you like. And of course, these countries had existed for millennia together with rules of intercourse and exchange and laws of how they would react with each other. So suddenly, if they're all swept up together and put in one place, the whole social order is broken down. Rules which had taken thousands of years to develop were broken and smashed. Taboos, relationships of people who were not supposed to see each other, everything was broken down. The whole social order was broken. And yet the government thought, they're all Aboriginal, they all look the same, let's sweep them up and for reasons of economy put them in these settlements, which will be very easy to manage and we'll teach them to live like us. And so they put them in these settlements, and of course the mood was one of incredible despair. People sat downcast in the dirt, feeling there was no hope. There was barbed wire around the fences and these horrible prefabricated huts were built in which Aboriginal people were supposed to live. Into this, in 1971, Geoffrey Barden, a young school teacher from the coastal cities, drove. And at the time, the people that worked in these settlements, the white people who ran the stores or the garages, had no truck with Aboriginal people at all. They were simply not interested in learning or even engaging with them. And Geoffrey Barden was interested. And he started teaching at the school, and he very soon realised that it was astonishing that here he was teaching children stories of Enid Blyton, when surely they had their own stories. And so he started talking to the children, and sure enough, they started telling him fantastic stories. So one day he decided that a mural should be painted on the school wall, and the school was such a horrible, ugly building anyway. So he started talking to two of the old gardeners, Long Jack Philippus and Billy Stockman Jappaljari, who were the gardeners and the groundsmen at the school. And he said, I'd like to paint this mural. And he suddenly noticed a huge interest and energy level in the settlement. People started talking, discussing, and all these different groups got together saying, what shall we paint, what shall we paint? Because of course many of the stories were sacred, secret, and could not be seen by uninitiated people. So eventually they came back and said, we have decided to paint the story of the honey ant dreaming on the school wall. And it was painted by the Billy and Long Jack. And the whole mood of the settlement improved. People started walking prouder. They felt that their culture was being honoured, that they had something to say. And Geoffrey found that in the evenings, the old men used to come round and talk to him and tell him more stories. Oh, it's not just the honey ant story. There are hundreds of stories. And of course, there are thousands of stories, because think of all the things that were created and these beautiful, complex stories. And to understand one of these stories, you must have the knowledge equivalent to being able to recite Homer's Iliad off by heart. Can you imagine that? None of you could do it. No, we don't know anyone who could do it. That is the profound level of knowledge that the initiated Aboriginal men had to have in order to create these works of art. And they started talking to Geoffrey Barden and telling him the stories. And as they did so, they started drawing designs and patterns to explain the topography to him. And he started picking up bits of building board and linoleum tiles, and they started drawing on them. And eventually, he started buying paint, and they started painting even bigger pictures. And one day, he decided, he had a pile of these pictures in his kitchen, to take them into Alice Springs and to sell them. And at that time, Aboriginal people were supposed to earn money by working in the garage as a mechanic or in the general store, pointless, thankless, meaningless tasks, just to get, as it were, dole money. And this, he thought, would be a much nicer way of them earning money, because the act of painting in an Aboriginal community is very community-based. The paintings are painted on the ground, and children and old people and everybody sits around them as they're painted. And everybody talks and everybody listens, and it's a really wonderful activity that everybody is involved in. So in order to be able to do this and earn money seemed a very good idea. So Geoffrey took the paintings in on the utility truck and sold them all for $10. And I was telling the class today that one day, recently, a woman came in to see me in my gallery, and she said, "Oh, Rebecca, I've been cleaning out, and I know you like Aboriginal art, and I've got this picture which I don't want. It's really old and battered, and I thought you'd like it." And she showed me this little piece of board, and it was all chipped around the edge. It was just builder's board. and it had some designs on it. And I looked at it, and on the back it had in chalk $10. And I said, gosh, I would absolutely love to have this more than anything in the world, but I can't have it because I can't afford it. And she said, oh, no, you can have it. And I said, no, I would love to have it, but it's worth a lot of money. It's worth about $250,000. And she said, no, she said, I was going to do up my kitchen, but now I'm going to buy a house. And she then took this picture. It was a beautiful picture by Uta Jangala, this artist, but not this picture. And she took it and sold it at Sotheby's. And she had been a nurse in Papunya in 1971, in Alice Springs, when Geoffrey Barden drove in from Papunya and sold the first Papunya paintings. And she had bought one to help the Aboriginal people. You can see from this painting that Papunya paintings are very, very beautiful. They're very classic and they're very austere. The colour palette is very confined to natural colours. There's no greens or purples or pinks. And the stories, you can again see the concentric circles, which represent the Chingari. And of course, this is a sacred secret painting, so I'm not going to tell you what it's about. This is a painting by Clifford Possum, who is arguably one of the great artists of Papunya Tula. Well, I say arguably, but you know, there's so many great artists there. It's literally like this Picasso, Van Gogh, Renoir. I mean, the talent is quite phenomenal, quite extraordinary. And you can see here, Clifford has a beautiful, beautiful serenity to his work. These U-shapes represent people, because if you sat down cross-legged in the sand, that's the shape that your body would make in the earth. And he has a really wonderful, wonderful serenity. And again, I was telling people today that when I first met Clifford in about 1988, it was in a creek bed in Alice Springs. And I said, oh, Clifford, would you come and have an exhibition in my gallery in London? And he said, yes, can I meet the Queen? And I said, yes, of course you can, and thought no more about it. And then a year later, I sent him the money to come to England, and I went to pick him up at Heathrow, and I was incredibly excited about the first one-man Aboriginal show ever really to happen. And I went to pick him up, and I hadn't thought anything about the Queen, of course. And he said, hello. And I said, hello, Clifford, welcome to England. He said, oh, we're going to meet the Queen. That was the first thing he said to me. And I had completely forgotten. So I thought, well, never mind. I'll drive past Buckingham Palace and show him where the Queen lives. And it'll be so exciting coming to London. There's so much we've planned. It's going to be fantastic. He won't mind. So we drove past Buckingham Palace and he said, we'll go in. And then I realised what I had done. I had just been like every other white person, and I had promised an Aboriginal something and taken it very lightly and thought nothing of it, of my word. And he had accepted me in good faith and trusted me. And he had left his country and come to a strange country on the strength of my words that he would meet the Queen. And I felt, as you can imagine, absolutely terrible about this. The whole pleasure of his visit went, and I felt really appalled at my behaviour. And so I tried to get him to meet the Queen. I rang up Buckingham Palace and I said, hello, can I bring an Aboriginal artist to meet the Queen? And of course they said, don't be stupid, you can't invite yourself to meet the Queen. And I rang up the Australian Embassy and I said, is there anything you can do? Can you arrange for me to take this Aboriginal artist to meet the Queen? They said, no, we can't do anything. And so I just felt incredibly depressed, and I didn't know how I was going to tell Clifford this, because as a leader of his people, of the Amatjira people, he had told everybody that he was going to London to meet the Queen, the leader of the British people, quite appropriately. And so that night was the exhibition, and I was very depressed and I wasn't enjoying it at all. And I was talking to this nice old man with a white beard, and he said, what's the matter, Rebecca? You don't seem very happy. And I said, no, I'm not happy at all. And I told him what I had done. And he said, well, can't the embassy fix it? And I said, no, there's nothing. I don't know what to do, and I'm going to have to tell Clifford tomorrow. And so the next day came, and at 9 o'clock the phone went, and it was this man, and he said, oh, hello, Rebecca, it's George Harwood here. I've spoken to my cousin, and she would be delighted to see you and Clifford at the palace today at 2 o'clock. Can you imagine? I mean, thank you, God, so much. And I never had to tell Clifford that I hadn't arranged it. And I went and I woke him up and I said, Clifford, we're going to be at the palace at 2:00 today. And it was fantastic. And we had an amazing day. And he said it was his number one day. And it was very, very special. Anyway, we'll move on. But that's Clifford's painting. This is a painting of the night sky, the Milky Way, and it's very beautiful. It's slightly later on, and you can see that colours, more Western colours, have been introduced to the natural ochres. And you can see here it's as though the sky, the universe has been slit, and you're looking through at the sky, and then the lightning and rain is coming down from it. And this is an even later picture from Papunya Tula. Again, you can see why these paintings have been so attractive to a Western audience accustomed to minimal and conceptual art. This could hang very easily in a gallery anywhere in Europe as a piece of contemporary art. And I think this is one of the things that's been so fascinating with Aboriginal art. It's managed to transcend its ethnicity, if you like. And it's been a long battle to get it taken out of the realms of ethnography and to be treated as serious international contemporary art, but it now is. And this is still a Chingari cycle. Even though the circles are not used, it's still a map of a tract of land. This is a painting by Billy Stockman Japuljari, who was the gardener at the school in Papunya. And it's very, very beautiful. It's a budgerigar dreaming. And even though you might think that these little flecks are swarms of budgerigars which fly around Central Australia, these beautiful birds which just fill the sky with fluttering energy, they're actually not. Billy has actually used these symbols of the ancestor spirit of the budgerigar. So it's really interesting. It works on two levels, both on a Western and to a Western and uninitiated eye, and also you don't need to know the whole story or the iconography just to get the feeling of the budgerigar. This is a painting by Walala, who was a very interesting story. In 1983, world headlines were made all over the world. Every newspaper said, last Aboriginals, lost tribe comes in from the desert. And Walala and his family were the last Aboriginals to have contact, to make contact. They had known that Europeans had lived in Australia, obviously, for a long time, but they had managed to keep outside the net and they'd wandered in the desert. But finally, the family group got so small that they were forced to come into a place called Kiwikara in order to meet other women and to arrange marriage. And Walala, of course, when the world's media descended on them, they didn't think of a quarantine or in vaccination or anything, and they just descended on them. And of course, they all got incredibly ill because they had had no contact with Europeans before, and so the germs were really bad. And Walala's older brother actually spent about 3 days in Kiwikara, saw the media circus, saw white man's life and thought, I've had enough of this. And he wandered out into the desert and he's never been seen since. And despite helicopters and planes and four-wheel drives trying to track him, nobody has ever seen him. Aboriginal people say he's still out there, but he refused to be part of the circus. However, Walala stayed, and he's a Pintupi man, and you can see in this painting there's a really kind of strong force in the work. Again, it is a Chingari cycle, it's a map of the land, but the way he's presented it is very, very, I think, Spartan and effective. Oh God, these are me putting the slides upside down. Don't worry. This is actually a door. So this is the ground and that's the sky. This is another community called Yuendamu, and they heard of the success of the painters in Papunya. It's a few hundred miles away, and they thought, we want some of the action. And so they painted the doors of their houses. And you can see here a very, very different style. Yuendamu work is much more colourful. The lines are more meandering. It doesn't have that classical austerity of Papunya work. And suddenly all the doors of the houses in Yuendamu were painted, and it was like a sudden cultural renaissance. And they said, we would now like to start an art cooperative and start selling our work. But unlike Papunya, they produced work that was a collaboration. So their paintings tend to be like this beautiful painting here, produced by many, many people sitting around. Often 12 to 20 artists will work on a single canvas. But again, it's characterized by these beautiful, very pretty colors and a flowing linear line. And you can see here the women with the digging sticks and the kulamons, and the witty sticks and the ceremonial ground. Another picture virtually of the same subject, and again characterised by these very, very bright colours. And Yuendamu art, like Papunya art, has provided a very good income for the artists and the cooperative which looks after them. Another painting again, this is a yam growing. You can see the women sitting here, and you can see the roots of the yam growing under the ground, and the women about to dig it. And this is an emu dreaming. A lot of the symbols in the paintings take their inspiration from the imprint left in the ground. So that's the symbol for an emu. And you can actually see here the tracks in the ground. Another community in the centre of the desert was La Jamanu, and La Jamanu was quite late on the painting scene. It didn't really happen until the very late 80s. And La Jamanu art is characterised, nobody knows why, by monochromatic, white and black on green. Nobody said you can't have pink and blue and orange and all the other colours, but they just chose not to. And again here you see a scene of women...
Black and white on green?
Yes. Yes, the background, the underpainting of that is green. And you can see here groups of women with their digging sticks and kulamons sitting around. A kulamon is an oval piece of wood, rather like a garden trug, used by women as a basket to put babies or vegetables. Again, an amazing painting, and you can see how it could appeal to a Western audience accustomed to minimal art. Again, very striking. And I think you can already see, we've only looked at 3 different Aboriginal countries, but you can see the incredible diversity and richness of the cultures and how very, very different they were. And yet, even though they're often painting the same subject. Again, a La Jamanu painting. Very striking, this time by a man called Ronnie Lawson. And you can see here the 3 marks which represent the orma, which are the incised marks of an initiated man, where hot ash is put into the marks and it heals as a scar that's raised. And often an initiated man is represented in painting by those 3 lines. Balgo Hills formed the Wallarati Artists Corporation in the late 80s and produced extraordinary paintings, very lurid and very terrifying. This is a painting of a very, very dangerous place where the snake, the rock serpents, live underneath. And you can see here the central snake. It sort of looks like he's been chopped up, and that's as though you're looking down at the ground and seeing bits of him through the holes in the ground. And the only information against this painting is this is a very dangerous place, approach with lighted spinifex flares. And it's by an artist called Old Mick Jacamara. This is a painting that's being done at Balgo Hills. I put that in just so you could see how the paintings are produced. And there is a lovely artist, Willem Pringa, who's resting after painting. I took this photo at night, so it's pretty impossible to see except for the dog's eyes gleaming. This was a ceremony that was done at Balgo Hills, and you can see the marks on the bodies of the dancers. And there's Yubana sitting there, who's one of the great painters of Balgo Hills. Balgo Hills is one of the most remote places in the world. From Alice Springs, it's about 6 or 7 hours flying in a little plane. You have to sort of hire a private plane to get there. And it was on the edge of an inland sea, a huge inland sea. And so when you fly off it, you just fly off the edge of the escarpment. So it's incredibly remote. And I put here some of the children from Balgo because it's very difficult for the children of Balgo because there is nowhere to go and there's nothing to do. And while that dancing ceremony was on, the young men were getting in their 4-wheel drives and just driving at 100 miles an hour as fast as they could to nowhere. There was nothing for them to do. Painting is the only option, really, and yet not everyone wants to paint, and why should they? This is an interesting painting from Balga Hills. It works on many levels. The two ducks by the pool, and then you can turn it up the other way and you see that little figure with his arms outstretched holding two long snakes. So again, a lot of these paintings are painted as though you were a bird flying over the land and looking down on the landscape. And it really doesn't matter which way up they are. These are women from Utopia, and you can see here them making marks in the sand, telling the story. And one of the greatest artists from Utopia was an old lady called Emily Kanawari, who I haven't actually got any of her pictures, but she often used that design that's painted on the women's breasts as an underpainting of her pictures. And her work is rather like this work of Yubina, very fluid and very organic. Now, this is a painting from a completely other place. We've moved from here to a country up here. So thousands and thousands of miles away, different language, different everything. And these people are from Fitzroy Crossing. And you can see a completely different style. They chose to paint on paper rather than canvas and to use poster paint rather than acrylic. And their paintings are very, very beautiful, rather like Sonia Delaunay or some of the French paintings. There's Mona Chaguna. The painting camps, the painting expeditions are really wonderful. People go out country, everybody comes along, and it's a time for hunting, for making tools, for everyone getting together, for the children to learn about the bush. Everybody camps outside, and during the day the paintings are made, and when people get tired of painting they go hunting or preparing the food. And you can see here that children all the time are looking and learning about the bush. These people all live in a little tiny town of Fitzroy Crossing, but they love going out camping to do painting trips. Oh, sorry, that's Mona making damper. This is one of my favourite artists. This is Butcher Cheryl Jangaloo, who is an absolute genius. He paints every day from 9 till 6 o'clock at night, when he puts down his brush exactly on the dot of 6 and goes to the pub, where he drinks until it closes, gets completely drunk, but every morning at 9 o'clock he is back painting these absolutely extraordinary paintings. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And there's his hat for those of you that were in the lecture today. That's the hat that floated down the York River. And that is one of Butcher's paintings. So you can see how incredibly finely detailed they are and how extraordinary his precision is. And he's in his late 80s now, but he's still producing such beautiful work. Again, on a painting camp, people carving boomerangs. And you can see what a fantastic communal activity the painting is. Everybody is together, everybody is discussing their ideas and sharing the knowledge of their country. And in fact, you can see that blue ground sheet. Well, the people at Fitzroy Crossing produced a painting as big as that ground sheet, and it was actually used in a court of law as evidence. Each person stood on the painting and stood where their land was and told the story of their land to the Aboriginal tribunal that had come out to the desert to sit and to hear their land claim. And as a result, they were awarded their land. So these paintings are not just pretty cultural artifacts, they're incredibly potent, not just for their intrinsic power, but for their political power in the Western world. And here is everybody with their paintings. This is another region. We've gone up now here to the Kimberley, and this is where Rover Thomas and Queenie Mackenzie and the great ochre painters come from. When a painting is done, it is sung into existence. And when Clifford Possum was staying with me, I would often come in to my flat and hear him singing these very beautiful songs as he sung the paintings into existence. And here you can see the paintings being held above the heads of the dancers. And this was a dream that Rover Thomas had about a whole new dreaming story, and this was the painting that he created. And Rover Thomas then started painting these paintings using ochre and abstracting these designs into incredible pictures, which then have been shown all around the world. But here you can see the first ceremony of that dream, and the paintings being held up and danced into life. And here you see a painting by David Downes of the Kimberley, with objects being held above the dancers' heads. That painting is done in natural ochres. There are thousands of communities across Australia, and I just put this slide in. This is from Nooka up here. And again, a completely different art form. Nooka had a mission station, and so there's a lot of religious symbolism in these paintings. This is by a wonderful old artist called Gertie Huddleston. And she and her 5 sisters are some of the greatest artists in the world, I believe, today. But I've just thrown this in just to give you an idea of the infinite variety of Aboriginal Australia. It is mind-blowing. This is a picture by Sambo Barabara, again from Nooka, and you can see, again, he's invented a totally new art form, quite figurative. The ancestral figures have not been abstracted into geometric symbols as they were in the early Papunya art. This is Tiwi Pakamani poles from the Tiwi people on Bathurst and Melville Island. Again, these represent an extraordinary culture. They're part of a mortuary ceremony, and very, very complex stories are attached to them. But again, quite a different cultural output. This is a burning. I was just with some people up in Yirrkala, and we were driving along when one of them just started throwing lighted matches out of the window. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I'm just burning the country." And it got really terrifying as we went along, because the fire just caught up so quickly, and I thought we would never get through it. But as you know, burning the country is an Aboriginal form of agriculture. And when white people first came to Australia, the reason that they pronounced it terra nullius was because one of the criteria for deciding that a country was occupied was whether there was a system of agriculture produced by the inhabitants. And of course, white people didn't think that Aboriginals had any system of agriculture or land maintenance, but in fact it's been proven that this fire burning helps regeneration of the bush, stops the bush becoming scraggy, produces new plants, and helps the animal life. But it's terrifying when you're in it. This is a detail of a Yirrkala bark painting. Again, we've gone to another place now. We're up here in Arnhem Land. And this is the home of the Yolngu people, who are very extraordinary. They paint on bark. And for example, here in this picture, you have a place where salt water and fresh water meet. The salt water is represented by these diamond shapes, and the fresh water by these lozenges. And this represents a very sacred place off the coast of Yirrkala, where fresh water comes up out of the sea. But you can see a totally different iconography used to express a sacred place and a sacred relationship with the land. Oh, more of the burning. Do you see why I was getting scared? This bark painting was produced not very far from this fire. This is a complete Yirrkala bark painting, and I was telling the group today that actually these bark painting, the Yolngu people were the first people to use art for political action. In 1967, they actually sent a bark petition to the government in Canberra saying, please, please do not mine our land. If you mine our land, you will destroy the web that connects everything. And the Australian government had discovered bauxite, which makes aluminium, up in Arnhem Land, and they had decided that they were going to build a huge super mine, which would, of course, have destroyed the sacred land. And if you think of the Yolngu mythology as a spider web, an incredibly complex and beautiful web where all the dream stories connect, everything connects, if you think of it like that, and pushing your hole through a spider web, how everything unravels, that was how the mine was going to be. And so the artists responded by sending this bark petition to Canberra saying, please, please do not build the mine. And it was very beautifully written. And of course, the brilliant thing about it was that the Australian government didn't have the way of answering a bark petition. If they'd sent a normal legal petition, the infrastructure would be there to have replied in a legal way. But they were totally thrown, because how do you respond to something that's so other? The Yolngu had introduced their culture into the political dialogue and demanded that new solutions had to be thought of, that they couldn't just reply in the same old legal jargon that they'd used. They actually empowered themselves by doing this. But unfortunately, they lost. The government said no. So the first ever land rights case was taken by a chap called Milpurum and others, a Yolngu man, versus the Commonwealth and Nabalco, and he took the government to court. And again, unfortunately, the decision by Justice Blackburn was against the Yolngu people. However, at that time, there was such an outcry because the bark petitions had made quite widespread news, and in fact, that decision resulted in the formation of the body that was later to become the Land Rights Tribunal and start giving land back to the Aboriginal people. So these paintings have incredible political and powerful impact. That's a bark painting showing the coming of the Macassans, who were Indonesian traders who traded with the Yolngu for 300 years before 1906, when the Australian government banned them from coming to the shores. This is Michael Riley, a wonderful Koori artist. There's a whole other subject, which is Aboriginal artists who have grown up in towns and have been deracinated. They've been taken away from their parents, as some of you saw in Bob's film, or they have not had the luxury of having knowledge handed down to them, and so they feel unempowered, but they know and want to express their Aboriginality. And Michael Riley was a brilliant photographer who just took photographs of his family and friends, and they just have an incredible directness. Sadly, he died of AIDS, and there was a big memorial show of his work at the Art Gallery of New South Wales last year. His last body of work was fascinating. He decided that he wanted to come back, or he was the reincarnation of an English aristocrat, and he did a whole body of work on that. Now, I've just put this in. This is absolutely nothing to do with Aboriginal art, but I just wanted you to show that, the power Aboriginal art has had with empowering other Indigenous communities. This is a picture of an African bush woman, Dada, and I got approached by the African bush people saying, we've seen what you've done with Aboriginal art. If we do some paintings, do you think you could do the same for us? And that's a whole other story. But it has been really fascinating what has happened with these people. And we've been fighting a big battle with De Beers, which actually I'm happy to say has just resulted in a positive outcome. This is by Anki, another wonderful African bushman artist. And this was an exhibition of African bushwomen quilts. And it was very interesting. Although I tried very hard to make this work, it seemed that there was a real division between art and craft, and this did not get the kind of acceptance that the paintings had done. And I just put this painting in to end. This is an amazing painting by Robert Campbell Jr., who was a Murray artist. That's a Koori artist from northern New South Wales. He had no traditional upbringing. And he grew up in Kempsey, and he one day, he'd spent time in jail, he was a labourer. One day he said to his wife, he was about 45 years old, he said, take me to the rubbish dump. And she goes, why? And he goes, I want to get some stuff to paint on. And she goes, what do you want to paint for? And he said, I don't know, I just want to paint, take me to the rubbish dump. So they drove to the rubbish dump, and they got some bits of wood that people had thrown away, doors and things, and he said, take me to the hardware shop, and so she did, and he bought some paint. And he started painting these amazing paintings of Australian scenes like death in custody, very political, all the things that were happening to Aboriginal people. And he invented this whole new iconography. No one had taught him. He hadn't been initiated as an Aboriginal, so he didn't know the meaning of the Aboriginal symbols. And I thought this was an incredible, touching painting, because he said about this painting, this is Halley's Comet in 1988, and he said, I saw the comet come over, and here he is. By the way, these are not ties that everyone is wearing. He'd seen Aboriginal X-ray art where the organs are shown, and he'd sort of adapted that for his own purpose. So these are internal organs. And here's the Aboriginal people outside their bark shelter, all pointing up at Halley's Comet. And he said, I don't know, but next time when that comet comes by, I hope that we're all together and we're all mixed up. So here you've got black, white, brown, half brown, black, and everybody's pointing up, looking happy and looking at the comet again. And so he had a vision that, I don't know how often Halley's Comet comes around, is it 200 years or something? That next time it came round, everybody would be happy and would be together. And I think that's such a lovely thing. And the last thing I just want to read you, which I think is something very surprising, and I never knew that he thought it, but Captain Cook, what he wrote when he first saw Aboriginal people, and it seemed that he had a much better understanding. And from what he said, I find it astonishing that then the collision of Europeans was so rampant and rapacious, given that Captain Cook understood this. He wrote, "They may appear to some to be the most wretched people on earth, but in reality they are far more happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the superfluous, but the necessary conveniences so much sought after in Europe. They are happy in not knowing the use of them. They live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and the sea of their own accord furnishes them with all things necessary for life. They live in a warm and fine climate and enjoy a very wholesome air, so that they have very little need of clothing. They seem to set no value upon anything we gave them, nor would they ever part with anything of their own." Thank you. Do we have any questions? Anyone have anything? Yes, can we have the lights on, do you think? Because I can't see anybody. Yes?
Well, you said that some communities are painting communally and some are doing it as individuals. Are they in those communities where they're doing it as individuals, are some of them doing it as part, as a group and some as individuals? Or is it just like, how do they arrive to do?
Well, sometimes if it's a big painting, everyone will contribute. It's not really a hard and fast rule, but it just seemed that at Yuendamu, everybody painted communally and there weren't single painters, whereas at Papunya, Clifford Possum or Billy Stockman or any of Johnny Warangula would all paint individually, although they would paint communally as well. There's no rules, just what everyone felt like on the day.
When they paint communally, do they communicate with each other?
Of course, of course.
Is there a coordinator who says you?
There is no coordinator. There's everybody's together.
Everybody just does what they want to do, or?
Well, yes, but remember that they're painting something that you have to have great knowledge to paint. It's not like they're just going, oh, I think I'll put a pink spot there. This is profound and difficult stuff that they're dealing with. So these are very, very brilliant, knowledgeable people. They have incredible reservoirs. And so the level of dialogue in which they're engaging is very, very high. And there are constraints because they know that the ancestor went from here to there to here to there. And of course, the other thing about the dreaming is that not every person knows the whole story. It's a brilliant piece of Aboriginal egalitarianism that custodians of maybe one dreaming story that might go right across Australia, everybody might own a little bit of it, but not one person owns the whole story, so that nobody can take power, nobody can become like a Hitler. And everybody, it only is when everyone comes together in a ceremony that the whole story can be enacted and the ancestor can be revered. So that's what's happening when these big paintings are done.